Gashmius. Ma is gematria Adam, Ban is gematria Behema. It's the two shemus of Yudke Vovke in a different milui. So it's both, of course, Elikus, but it's Elikus whether it manifests like the Nefesh Elikis or like the Nefesh Habamis. Or different ways you can explain it, but basically that's what Ma'aban represents. And the Yichud of Ma'aban is the Kavanah, obviously in the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, the Dafkin Tachtenim, Dafkin where in Ban should be the Amshacha of Liyas Leis Baruch, Elikus Begoli. So you have the Yichud of Ma'aban represents essentially in different Asias, that in this physical world should become a keli for Elikus. On its own, there's a tension and a certain what's the word I want to use? A certain tension and dissonance between Ma and Ban, between Ruchnis and Gashmis, or Alyenim and Tachtenim. I mean, there's so many words you could use for it. Neshama and Guf. And here, the Kavanah is Yichud Ma'aban. And that was the Aveda. And that, in a way, also explains why Rivka was Dafka, like Shoshana ben Achechim. She lived in a house of B'suel and Lovon, which was not exactly a house of Tzadikim. But the point was that that's where Ban resides. Like the Neshama comes down Lamata in a world that is Cheshach Kafla Mechupul. And the Kavanah is, again, to connect it to Ma, which is representative of Yitzchak. That's Yichud Ma'aban. So therefore, that represents the concept of Shlichus in general, the Shlichus on Neshama Lamata, the Neshama of every person, and specifically, as the Rebbe continues, the Shlichus among all the Neshamas, there are those that had the schus to become Shluchim of the Nesidarenu, Shluchim of the Rebbe, and in their Avedis HaShlichus itself, directly are called Shluchim. And the Rebbe connects it, of course, to the Avedas, the Shlichus, that every Shliach goes out wherever they are in the world. And what's the Kavanah? To bring your Futzman Secha Chutza, to Megala, Elikus, every person in their individual place, basically the Yichud Ma'aban. So we are all like Eliezer Eved Avram, Shluchim of Avram Avinu, in this case the Rebbe, to achieve this objective. Now, there's a lot of protim in the Sikha, but I want to touch upon a few key things that are really, I think, very powerful. I mean, everything there is powerful. But especially the Rebbe goes into a nigladik shakvataria pilpul, whether based on a Tesvus in the Gemara, I think in Psachim it is, I don't remember which Masechta. But he brings there what's the din of Eliezer, what kind of gedder did he have? So there's an opinion that he was like a Shliach, Pshute. Shliach and Halach has certain guidelines. There's another opinion in Tesvus that says that he was like a Shadchan. And there's a difference between the two, as the Rebbe explains it, from these Mefarshim, that the difference in a Shliach and a Shadchan is, a Shliach is Shluchah Shalom Kameseh. He has no, when he chooses to be a Shliach of the Mishaleach, he has no interest of his own in it. Can't be like he's making money off of it, for example, or some other agenda. A Shadchan, not necessarily. A Shadchan you hire, and you can pay him for the Shadchanis, and maybe that may even be his incentive. He's not quite, let's call it transparent. There is a mitzias of a mamutza here, the Shadchan. And there's a halachic nafkamina between a Shadchan and a Shliach in these matters, as he discusses there in the Sikha and the Haaretz. And the Rebbe, of course, continues and says that basically it seems like the maskon is that he was a Shliach. But nevertheless, there is that Havamin. And what's the difference in the concept of Shlichus of Avedis Hashem? So when you're a Shliach, in the general terms, you can do it in two ways. You can do it in a way, yes, you're fulfilling what you were sent to do, because either way, Eliezer accomplished his mission. Even if you say it was a Shadchan, he did his job be'amunah, and he brought back Yitzchak, and he brought back Rivka to Yitzchak. So it wasn't like something went wrong. But he had his own. He's not completely bottled to the Mishaleach, which means that he's doing it as a favor or however you want to explain it, but it's not a complete bit. So like we say, Ani nivresi l'shamish es keni. So that means that I was created only one thing, to l'shamish es keni. But then there's a nusach that says Ani le nivresi ela l'shamish es keni. What's the difference between the two nuschayos? So we know when it says loy ela, it's likuva. So even though Ani Nevreis L'Shamash Zkeni is definitely a bittul, because you're created to serve Hashem, not to do anything else, but it doesn't have the total exclusivity. When you say Ani Loi Ella, you're saying there's nothing else at all. So in the language of Chassidus, the Rebbe doesn't bring it in the Sikha, but I'll bring in some of the Rebbe Rashab's Lashenis and these type of things, like the difference between Bittul Hayesh and Bittul B'Mitzias. So it's both Bittul. But what's the difference? They both are Bittul and utter Bittul. The difference is one is a Yesh, a Batul, means it exists, but it's dedicating its life. It's like you hire someone to do work for you, and he's doing it faithfully, but he still gets his parnasa, he still has his own Mitzias. Bittul Mitzias means, like we talk, like he says about the Ovis Hein Hein Amarkava, that 24 hours, 24/7, nothing else but. He says, I think in the Perich of Gimel, he says, Lo Yimakova to anything else but Eibishter. So it's like really rules out anything. When you say Bittul Hayesh, you could say, yeah, you're bottled to the Eibishter, but it doesn't mean you don't have any other thing going on in your life. To say 24/7, I remember there was a journalist that visited New York, came to 770, the early Lameds, and he came for one of the Tishrei, I don't remember when it was, I think, Fabrengen maybe, but my father knew him and I met him. And he was like, he had never been in an environment like that. And I asked him what his impression was. So I remember with his first impression, he says, I never saw a man, talking about the Rebbe, that like, as soon as you see him, you see he's 24/7 completely dedicated to one thing and one thing only. You know, everybody has, okay, you daven and then you go home, you have a meal, you have a family, you have other things you do. Here's a man that whatever he's doing, it looks to me he's only doing one thing, serving God. Whether, you know, because he saw the Fabrengen and he saw davening and he saw all the things and he saw the Rebbe's intensity. That was his impression, and he didn't like study every second of the Rebbe's life. He just picked up that. That was his completely secular person's impression. And it's true. I, as a matter of fact, years later, someone asked me a question about the Rebbe, something, you know, wanted to be something that special about him. So I said, well, here's a man. I said exactly what this guy said. And I said, I'll take it a step further, that if you ask anyone, any chassid, what is the Rebbe doing at a certain point in the last 40 years, we can know exactly where he was any second of the day. He said, yeah, tell me, where was he 4 o'clock in 1962 on Tuesday afternoon? So I said, he probably just finished davening mincha, because it was always 3:30, and then he went to his room, either learning or answering, but we know exactly where he was. And he was like, he said, really? I said, yeah. The Rebbe, I mean, we know he traveled once to France for a few months, but besides that, all day you knew exactly where he was. Erev Rosh Chodesh, we knew where he was. The 15th of the Chodesh, Shabbos, Yontif, weekdays. You may not know exactly what he's doing because you're not in his room, but where he is. So I remember he said to me, you know what, I don't even know where I was 5 days ago. As a matter of fact, I don't even want to know. So it's an interesting contrast. I know I'm speaking in a very, I guess, very balbatish, practical way, but it's an interesting contrast. Most people, everybody's got their little secrets and their little places they go to. I'm not saying Chaz v'Shalom anything prohibited, but here a person that is on a mission, total, I mean, you could see that, and it was in every possible way. Anyway, just getting back to our point here. So essentially, the difference in a Shadchan and a Shliach can be a Shliach can do the work, but he also has other things going on. Whatever, real estate projects or other projects. I'm not here to talk about any individual here, but everybody's got their things, and I'm not here to criticize. Everybody has to make their choices. But the Rebbe spoke about it beferish, and that's sikh. It's not my original ideas. It says it there clearly. And then the Rebbe speaks there briefly, the famous chkira that the Rebbe brings in a number of places about the different levels of shlichus. You know, at this point we already have 5 levels that Rebbe spoke about. First it began with 3 levels based on the Ragachover and Rabbi Yosef Engel, where they talk about when you say a shliach, and there's different expressions. Sometimes a shliach, so you make a shliach, let's say, for Kedushin. So the shliach Kemuvin is not being Mekadesh the Isha. He's only serving Shluch Shlod and Kamese. But the question is, how much of the Mishaleach is he? So some say it's only the Maisa Shlich, is that moment when he brings the shtar to whoever the intended recipient is. That moment when he gives the shtar, he is Shluch Shlod and Kamese. But that's it, not before, not after, and not the rest of him. Only another level is more than that, his yad. actually becomes like an extension of the yad of the Mishalech. To the point that it comes another level, that his whole mitzias, Kamuvin, b'shas ha-shlichus. If he's once finished the shlichus, he finished. But as long as he's a shliach, his whole mitzias becomes like the Mishalech. These are all different levels when we say shluchis shlodin kamesei. Then there's two more levels that Rebbe added. This is the mems primarily, and mostly around the Kinus HaShulchan we would talk about these. It's already printed in sichos and letters in different places. First letter that Rebbe wrote, I think, to the Kinus HaShulchan in Eretz Yisrael, the shluchim that went in Lamed Vav Zayin Aches. So the Rebbe, they started a Kinus already earlier, I think in Mem Aleph. The Rebbe already has a letter to them. He talks, I think, about these levels. And to the point that Rebbe goes even further, that it's not just the mitzias of the Shliach, the Mishalech, then comes a point where the Shliach is like one with the Mishalech. And then there's a final level, I believe, if I recall correctly, is that it's the Mishalech himself. However, he's like being nimshach through the Shliach. So I remember when we first, when I was a Bacher and we were learning about these levels, I don't remember who mentioned it, maybe it was we were discussing it, I don't remember now, but the truth is, if you look in Ayin Beis, and talking about the Rebbe Rashab, and in Sadik Daled, Hemshech Sadik Daled from the Frierdiker Rebbe, which is based on Ayin Beis, and then in Tovshin Tezvov, in the Tishrei Mamorim, the Rebbe speaks about, they all speak about levels of bittul, of oir. Not the word shliach, but the level of oir, and they talk actually about 3, 4, and then a 5th level. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in Tovshin Tezvov, when the Rebbe said those Mamorim, so it was clear that it was based on the Maimorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe, Tafshay Sadik Dalet. Tafshay Sadik Dalet is known as, some call the deepest Hemshech, deepest Sugiyas of Chassidus, to the point that when the Frierdiker Rebbe was, this is Agav, when he was saying those Maimorim, the famous story that one of the Chassidim came over to the Frierdiker Rebbe and said, the Elam versteht nicht. It was too deep. And the Frierdiker Rebbe stopped the Hemshech. If you look in Sadik Dalet, it's printed in Sefer Mamorim Tovshin Yud Aleph, not from the Rebbe, from the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe continued printing, and there you'll see Atkan Nitten Lahaitik. I think the end last Maimon is a Pasha Vayetzei Maimon. It starts Tishrei Rosh Hashanah. I think it's like 7, 8 Maimorim, and then it stopped. The Rebbe, when he heard that, our Rebbe, when he heard, he went to that guy and gave him such a chelik. He said, "What's the Rebbe? You know, it's too deep for you. Don't come." You know, I mean, what are you telling the Rebbe that's too deep? The Rebbe says, "My Marich Chassidus." You don't tell the Rebbe what to say, what not to say. And then the Frierdiker Rebbe later expressed himself, "I'm a vil gem dem elam avonim tevis and margolius, or mevil zukerkes." You want to give the people precious jewels, and they want candies. That was the Frierdiker Rebbe's expression. Bottom line is the Hemshech was never finished, which was a big shad, of course, because it was mamish getting into the deepest inyanim, and the mitten suddenly stops. Okay, and there he talks about 3 levels of bittul of eir to the moir. The bittul of the mitzias of the eir, the mahus of the eir, it's a whole thing. Then, in Tavshin Tezvov, and I remember I confirmed this with Rabbi Yael, because I want to really, it was very interesting, the Rebbe is chazing these mamorim, and says, v'yesh leimer, that there's a 4th darge in bittul. So everyone was a big chiddush in Tavshin as well, that Rebbe is adding a level that's not even the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer. But later, when Ayin Beis was published in Tavshin Lamed Zayin, Lamed Ches, the Rebbe said to publish the whole Ayin Beis, not just the beginning. So then we discovered in Ayin Vov is the basis of the Maimorim of Tzadik Dalet, and there's taka 4th level. So the Rebbe was taking it from Ayin Beis. Not to minimize the Rebbe's saying it, but it was not a chiddush of the Rebbe. The Rebbe Chazed essentially what it said in Ayin Beis. And someone has say that if you're really medayik, you may see a 5th level. But that I don't want to go into right now. That's a whole other discussion. But the point is that it corresponds very much to the Rebbe's idea about shliach and shlichus. Now, this is not just a stam shliach and oir. In Likutei Torah, that the Rebbe brings in a number of places, Likutei Torah Vayikra, he brings the concept of shliach, shluchas lodin kamesei, and he has the word mamish, shluchas lodin kamesei mamish, and he says these aces, the Alter Rebbe in the Likutei Torah, that every darge outside of atzmus is a geder of a shliach. Why? Because everything is, only atzmus is the mishalech, only atzmus is the moker, amiti. Everything else is already a shliach. Even Ein Sof itself is a shliach. So the Rebbe, Alter Rebbe says it. And I think in a different Kinus HaShluchim Sich, I don't remember which, maybe Mem Zayin, or the earlier years, I'm Chazri now Nun Beis, the Rebbe in a footnote, when we gave in the Sikha, the Rebbe wrote, V're'ei shal shuvas, I think he said Harivash, and he just left ... or Chenhu, something like that. And I remember it was like a chiddush because the Rebbe wanted us to find in the Shal Shuvas the Lashon Mamish. Now usually, when you say Mamish is pretty much a Lashon from Chassidus and from the Rebbe, Chelik Elikam. And Mamish, the Rebbe uses Mamish very often. You're not going to find it very often in Nigla. Check it out. Go find a Nigla, you're going to find the word Mamish. But we went to start looking and we found it. It's Seichen. I think it's Mem Dalet or Mem Zayin. I don't remember which Sikh. It's a Mugadik Sikh. So the Lashon Shluchas Lon Kamei say Mamish is not just in Chassidus, it's actually in a Nigla, in a Shal Shuvas Harivash. I think it's Rivash. I may be mistaken, but I'm almost sure that's what it is. I would have to look it up. But it's all Tzeichen, it's all printed, so you can find it. But going back to the point, what you have here is then that Oir and Shliach fits very well according to the Alter Rebbe, because everything is in the day Shliach of the Eibishter. The question is, and that's where the Shidduch and the Shadchan rather and the Shliach come into play. The question is, how deep is this mamutza? And this is where I want to connect it back to the Rebbe Rashab. In Ayin Beis, where he talks about all these in Yonim, big theme of Ayin Beis, actually the central theme I would say, is the interface or the mamutza between Elokus and Welt, and Metzius. The whole Ayin Beis begins with that, Keser. What is Keser? Keser is a mamutza between Ein Sof and Atzilus and the worlds below it. And the Rebbe Rashab explains it throughout the whole Hemshech. Some say an interesting note you can point out is that the Rebbe Rashab himself, according to Tzemach Tzedek, was born on Chav Cheshvan in the year Kisra. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek says. So Chav is Rosh Hashanah, Chav Cheshvan Rosh Hashanah is Keser, and Kisra is in Aramaic is Keser. So the Rebbe Rashab himself embodies that level of Keser. So it's not a surprise that Ayin Beis, the whole Ayin Beis, which is such a magnum opus, such a Yesod, is all about Keser. But what's the discussion? The discussion is, whenever you deal with a mamutza, it's a complicated thing. Why do you need a mamutza in the first place? Because two levels don't speak to each other. But think of a person, one person speaks Hebrew, another person speaks English. And they don't speak the other language. What do? So you bring a meturgeman, a translator. The translator knows both Hebrew and English, and he translates it. But is this translation going to be perfect? Is he going to say over exactly everything in Hebrew exactly the right way? Or is he a Metzias L'Atzmei and he can make a mistake, or he may not find exactly the right word? The Rebbe brings in the early Krachim of Likutei Sichos about Evan Tivan, who translated the Rambam from Arabic to Hebrew. As we know, besides Mishnah Torah, the Rambam wrote everything in Arabic, including Pirush HaMishnayos and all the Nevuchim and so on. He wrote it all in Arabic. So in Evan Tivan, who's one of the first and great translators of the Rambam, so he has a whole Akdama how he translated. Because at the end of the day, two languages, anyone who works in writing knows it's not so simple. Translating certain words, how do you translate Mamal Kalaman, for example, into English? It fills the world. I understand that's a technical translation, but is that what it means? There's a lot more to it. How do you explain, there's so many words, bittel even. What's the word for bittel in English? Being I work in this area, I'm always struggling to find the right words. And sometimes you need a lot of words to explain one word in Hebrew, because it's a concept, and a concept can't always be captured in one word. Sometimes you could, sometimes you can't. A shulchan is a table, fine. But when you deal with more edler topics and subjects that are more sublime, you need more words usually to explain an idea. But getting back to this, so Meturgeman is he like a Shadchan or is he like a Shliach? And in Ayin Beis, he struggles with this. When I say struggles, I don't mean the Rebbe Rashab, he struggles with a Nukuda, then every mamutza, you're going to have to deal with this issue. So when you're teaching, for example, a child, Torah, a young child, a new child, we all know you have to bring down the idea to the child. You are serving as that mamutza now. You're the meturgeman. Maybe not in language, but at least in the idea. You can't just take a brilliant idea from a shtickle Gemara or a shtickle Chassidus and just say it to a 5-year-old. You have to some way channel it. The question is, how do you know you're maintaining and preserving the integrity of the original? And sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to give a mashal. Sometimes the mashal is not always daimel and nimshal. So bottom line is, as soon as you're dealing with a mamutza between two realities, and here we're talking about between Beida and Nivra, between the Eibishter and creation, there's no question that there's going to be many different levels. That's why essentially when you talk about Seder Ishtalshalos, you say Atzilus is Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'garmu echad. Right? Total bittul. But then when you say, what about higher than Atzilus? Is higher than Atzilus more bottle than Atzilus? The answer is yes. Lower than Atzilus, Bria is not bottle Talakos, but it's not the bittul of Atzilus. What are you saying really? You're saying that the different levels of Seder Ishtalshalos, the different levels of the Mamutza, each level, it depends what it is. Like we know the example in Chassidus talks about Maiver and Islapshus. When something's B'derech Maiver, it's just like passing through. Like let's say you want to transmit a flow of water through a pipe. That's B'derech Maiver. The pipe doesn't change the water. The water as it's flowing. But what happens if the pipe is corroded or rusty or the pipe has something in it? So then it's going to affect the water. Like a funnel, for example, it just flows, just takes, let's say, the wine from a barrel and you're putting it into a bottle, or from a bottle into a cup. So it doesn't change the muhusa of the liquid. But then there are things that absolutely change. Slapshus means that it retains some of the properties. So when you say, for example, that Moshe Rabbeinu, Leipzig Taima, Moshe, as he was in Atzilus, L'Kutei Torah, the Alter Rebbe says, he spoke to Parei Mitzrayim without any filters. That's a unique thing, because usually Atzilus has to go through Bria, Yitzir, Asir. Think of like going on an express train or a local train. The local train has to stop and that's called Islapshus. So essentially, the whole concept to be able to bridge Elikus and Welt is not a simple process. It sounds like, okay, you know what, we're in the world, and just bring Elikus into the world. You know, it takes time, it takes a darge, achadarge. Look, thousands of years that we're already struggling to bring the Mashiach and the Gula. Why? Because to reconcile a mitzias of the yesh, of a world of cheshach kafel mechupel, and moli klippus is sitra achra, and Rishayim Gevrim Bey, and all the Lashanas the Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya, and to reconcile that with a world of pure elikus, not a simple process. So basically, Seder Ishtalshalos you could look at as stepping stones in this mamutza. So for instance, you know, for example, the two opinions in Chassidus brings, it's really three opinions about whether the Eiris are Mitsuyarim or not. So there's an opinion about Eiris, Eiris and Kalim. So the question is, the Spheres, are they the Eiris or are they the Kalim? So in a simple example, the Pardes brings that the Kalim the Eiris are completely shapeless. They have no shape. There's no such thing as Eira Chachma. It's the Klei HaChachma that makes the Eira Chachma into, like for example, he gives the example, imagine taking clear liquid, water, and you put it into different cups or different tubes of different colors. A blue cup, a red cup, an orange cup, a green cup. And you look at the cup and it looks like it's red. Is the water red? Is the water blue? No. The water is looking that way because the keli made it look that way. But if you pour the water out of the cup, it's the same water in all these cups in the same color, which is colorless, essentially. So that would be an example where the kelim create the tzir, and the eir is eir pashat. But then there's an opinion of the Mekubalim, there are Kanti, and there's different opinions that says, no, the eir also has some form of shape. It's not as shaped as the keli, it's not as identifiable yet, but there's something there. That's why it ultimately fits into the keli. And this is considered to be two opinions. Chassidus obviously is metavech and says they're all true. And what's the difference between them? What are they arguing about? It's a machlekes and mitzias? No. It's a machlekes in actually the level of the interface, like the Shadchan and the Shliach discussion. How much of the tzir of the Welt is involved and how much not? Because when you want to interface between Dira b'tachtenim, the question is, if it's going to be a Dira le'is baruch and the Eibishter is Hashem Echad, and he has no shape and no form and no color, so what will happen to all when they join together Dira b'tachtenim? What happens to all the details of this world? Do they disappear? On the other hand, if they remain at Tzir of Nivroim, so what happens to the Achdus Hashem? So the machlekes of the Mekubalim is essentially how that Achdus manifests. Is it more on our terms, and therefore it has tzir, or is it more on Hashem's terms, and therefore it does not have tzir? And the ultimate answer is both are true, that they're both levels. There's a level of Elokuz that relates to us. That's like the opinion of Eris Mitziyarim, and there's a level of Elokuz that doesn't relate to us, that's beyond us. And we need both. We have Aveda Apitam V'das, where we are thinking of Elokuz in a way that we relate to. We understand the Eibishter, we love him. Kemuvin, it's not all like Machshavesa, Machshavezechem. But then there's another level when we're in Mizbein Nasev of Kalam, for example, and there we understand the Eibishter is beyond us. And you need both. You need Ava and you need Yira. You need a Elokuz that relates to us, and you need a Elokuz that's beyond us. And then you come to realize that both are really one, which is already the third level that joins both levels of the Mamutza. So the real discussion that the Rebbe is having in the Sikha Chayei, if you read it closely, is this element when the Mishaleach sends a Shliach, how much of the Shliach is independent of the Mishaleach? And I don't mean independent necessarily in a negative way. The fact is that Rebbe said, I sent you there, and when Shluchim would ask the Rebbe a question, very often he would say, Kidas Yedidim Mevinim Al Asar. Check with people on location. Why couldn't the Rebbe answer? I'm a Shliach of the Rebbe. I want the Mishaleach to answer. So the Rebbe once wrote to someone who the Rebbe wrote, Kidas Yedidim Mevinim. He says, I don't want Yedidim Mevinim. I want the Rebbe's Eitzah. So the Rebbe said, Was ardir as ich al empferen durch Yedidim Mevinim? Why do you mind that my answer will go through Yedidim Mevinim? What does that mean? It means because the whole kavanah is not that everything comes Mamay Lamata. It sometimes has to come Mamata Lamayla. So the question is, how much is Mamata Lamayla, how much is Mamay Lamata? And it's not an easy question to answer. So I'm not talking about Chaz v'Shalom, a Shliach, or somebody decides they have their own company, and they're, God forbid, cut off from the Mishalech. We're not talking about that. But even as an independent Shliach, how much of it is your thinking, how much of it is the Rebbe's thinking? Now, Kemuvin, we want the Chushei HaMekabel to be like Chushei HaRav, Chushei HaTalmid like Chushei HaRav. You want the Shliach to become so permeated with the Rebbe's approach that he himself is applying that. The famous story, I must have told it here, maybe not. Rabbi Adon, what was his name? Rabbi Adon, he was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek. Will come to me in a minute. Anyway, his first name was Rabbi Adon. In the early years in Tafshin Yud and Yud Aleph, when people wrote to the Rebbe after the stalkers of the Frierdiker Rebbe, like they had questions what to do in their shlichus and their meizdas. So the Rebbe, a few places wrote, you do a hasipur, that you should get together with Anash, have an asifa, discuss it, and do what everybody, the majority agrees, the consensus. And he writes, ki yidu hasipur shel Rab Adon. The name eludes me. Okay. What's the sipur? It's a Meidike story that Mamish captures this theme beautifully. Rab Adon was a chassid of Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek would go often to Peterburg to do askonas on behalf of Eden. The Tsarist Russia, and you had to always negotiate with them to make life of the Jews a little easier, taxes, where they lived, their parnasa. And it was always a sakana actually. You do this to put him about it all. Once the Tzemach Tzedek couldn't go, whatever reason, so he called him Rabban, and he said to Rabban, I'm sending you as my shliach to go to Petersburg, which was the capital, and you will negotiate, you'll discuss the issues. Rabban asked the Tzemach Tzedek, "Was tue ich ebecha b'safek?" What should I do if I have a doubt? Remember then there was no email and there was no faxes and there was no phones, so you're miles and miles away. So the Tzemach Tzedek answered, "Boy al das atzmei, al das atzmecha." Build it on your own day, figure it out yourself. The Rebbe Marash was in the room when this took place, and he thought to himself, he didn't say anything, he thought to himself, Rabban is a big chassid and a big ask and everything, very nice, but something, that Al Das Atzmei rubbed him the wrong way, like as if he has his own independent autonomy, like lacking bittul. He didn't say anything, but he thought to it. Anyway, Rabban went off to Petersburg, comes back, One day they're sitting at the table, Lubavitch, the Tzemach Tzedek, I don't know if it's Shabbos or a meal. Tzemach Tzedek suddenly gets very serious. He says, Rabban Matatzach in Peterburg. So Rabban was struggling in Peterburg with an issue. Tzemach Tzedek sensed it. They waited a few minutes. Tzemach Tzedek smiled. And he said, good. Mechaven gewen. In other words, he resolved the issue, and he did as the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek would have done. So Rebbe Marash realized that Rabban actually was much deeper than he thought. He thought this Das Atzmei is like a problem. He realized, no. If you're a robot and a puppet, what's the chiddush that you're a shluch shalom kamesei? You don't have a choice. Here's a man like a Rabban, a big lamdan, a big Baal Mechin, an intelligent person, has his own independence. And we know a Shliach has to be an independent Bar Das. You can't hire an Eved or a Cheresh Sheitav Cotton to be a Shliach. It has to be a Bar Das, an adult, that makes the decision, I'm going to be your Shliach. And even though Yadas Atzmei, Ad Kedei Kach, he had worked it out, that his Das was machubin to the Tzemach Tzedek, so he realized that's even a higher level. So in other words, bittul does not mean that you completely lose your whole identity. It means, adrabah, you worked on your identity to become, like I said before the Lashon, Chushei HaTalmid, become like Chushei HaRav. Your methodology, your way of thinking is like the Rebbe would think. So ultimately, the goal is, that's a Shliach. A Shadchan is a lower level, means he's doing the work that is being told him to do, and he's doing it faithfully, but he's still an identity of his own. He may have his own agenda. And now, of course, there are many levels in between, which can be elaborated upon. But I thought this is a tremendous sikha in the sense, first of all, it touches upon such a Yiseides Dik'inyan, Yichud Ma'al Ban, but how that Yichud takes place, you need a Shliach for that. Because Ma'al Ban are very different. And there's different levels, basically different levels of Memutzayim. So obviously our goal is to be at the highest level of Shluch Shalom Kamesei, but everyone has dargahs. Even every day we say, V'haftes Hashem Elokecha. You don't jump to B'chol Meidecha, B'chol Avavcha, and then B'chol Nafshecha, and then B'chol Meidecha. Because it takes stages to get to the highest level of Bittul. Anyway, we should be zeichet to be reunited. Hu Yigalenu, the Rebbe Rashab, and all the Rabbeim. Everyone have a very good day and a good